Hello, I'm Tony Parsons, and welcome to the Tony Parsons Show. As a news broadcaster and journalist for the past 50 years, I've reported on the major news events that have shaped our nation. I've interviewed prime ministers, premiers, thought leaders, and other people of distinction from around the world. My goal with this interview series is to help you, my audience, discover the person behind the credentials, while at the same time I'll invite them to share their professional insights, experiences, and aspirations. I'm pleased to say that my guest today is Dr. Bonnie Henry, who happens to be the Provincial Health Officer for the province of British Columbia, the first woman in that position. She served as Clinic Associate Professor at the University of British Columbia. She was a family doctor and a specialist in public health and preventative medicine. And as many of you are aware, she led the province of British Columbia's response on the COVID-19 pandemic and the drug overdose emergency. In fact, she was recognized in the New York Times as, and I'm quoting here, the most effective public health officer in the world. That, Dr. Henry, is quite a list of credentials, and I want to thank you for being with us today to spend some time.
Well, thank you for having me, Tom.
For this interview, I'd like to be the voice of what I believe is a very curious public that have a variety of questions about Dr. Bonnie Henry, after what was undoubtedly one of the most difficult times of our lives here in Canada. I thought I'd begin our conversation by taking things back to the beginning, your beginning. I understand you're an islander, but I'm not talking about Vancouver Island. I believe you grew up on Prince Edward Island. Can you tell us a little bit about your life there?
Yes, well, I have to call it the Far East when we're out here because people have a different concept of what East is. But yes, my family is from Prince Edward Island. I was actually born in New Brunswick. My father was in the military, so we moved around a lot. But I had the privilege of growing up in what was traditional Mi'kmaq territory on Prince Edward Island. And it's a wonderful place to be from. And I still carry the red sand and salt water in my roots. Most of my family are still back home in Prince Edward Island.
How did you kindle this interest in healthcare?
Well, that's a really good question. I'm the first person in my family who's ever been anything in healthcare, but it was something that I knew at a very early age. My older sister, would tell the story of when we were young. She ended up with appendicitis and was in hospital when we lived in Newfoundland, and she thinks that was what triggered my desire to be a doctor. And she said, I remember you coming in, and I remember this, of course, as well, but that I was fascinated with this whole concept of, problem and solution. And she said, you weren't like caring for me like a nurse. It was more about how to make things better. So, but I did know at a very early age that medicine was a passion, something that I wanted to go into.
I want to talk about one member of your family, and that is your sister, Lynn, who I understand was a great comfort to you during this ordeal. And she co-authored your book, which was called, as most people know, Be Kind, Be Calm, Be Safe. And you spent a lot of time together during that time. Was Lynn as great a comfort as she seems to have been?
Absolutely. And I have to laugh because Lynn is my older sister. I'm number 2 of 4. So I have 2 younger sisters as well, who are on the East Coast. And early on in this, when the pandemic started, we were still not sure what was going to happen. And Lynn and I had made arrangements for my younger sister and our niece and nephew to come out and visit for March break. And they happened to arrive here at the same day that we ended up closing things down. And so we had to cut that March break short and send them back home to PEI. And I originally thought that my sister Lynn should go home as well and spend time with our parents who are elderly or older. But she said, no, I'm going to stay because I think you need me here. Mm-hmm. And so she did. And she was with me for the first month of the pandemic. And it was a great relief to have her around, to have somebody there, mostly. And what she was doing that I didn't realize until later was recording in her mind and taking notes about some of the things that were happening. And I think she really recognized that this was a very unusual time and a unique time in our existence, and that making a recording of that and putting that down in writing, what was happening during that time was something that would be important for the future. So the book was all her idea. I don't actually have a memory of agreeing to write it, but she works in the publishing world, in the book world, and got us started on that. And I'm really glad we did. It does remind us of how many things were unknown at that time and how challenging it was, and what an unusual period it was for us to go through.
You know, the last time we talked, you were very high profile and you were in front of cameras every day. That was the height of the pandemic, and you were very much in our lives trying to keep us safe. But when you got home at the end of the day, how did you separate your personal life from all that chaos?
Well, I'm not sure I did it very well, to be honest. It was all consuming, and has been for the better part of almost 4 years now, if we think about where we are right now. But particularly the first 2 years of this, it really was my life. It was very challenging for me, and we had very long days, and I'm not the only one. There were so many people that were working very long days, trying to get an understanding of what was going on, trying to make the right decisions. But at the end of the day, I was pretty exhausted and would usually go home and just lie on the floor often and listen to music, have a glass of wine or something that sort of helped me cope with things.
How has your life changed since those times?
It still is strange to me that I'm very recognized by people a lot. I know, it's hard to think of a blur. At the time, it seems like everything was going so slowly, and every single day lasted a month. But when I look back on that time, things changed so dramatically, and we connected with people in ways and disconnected with others in some ways. And um, I think my life has changed irrevocably in that I'm recognized a lot still. Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes, sadly, I'm still subjected to some people's hatred and concerns and frustrations and anger about what happened.
Well, time has passed since then. How do you feel that the healthcare system handled the crisis overall here in BC?
It's really hard for us to say, we tried very hard here in BC in particular to find a balance, to recognize that measures that we needed to put in place to try and keep people who are most at risk, and really that's our seniors, our elders, people who have underlying illnesses, to put measures in place to protect them, particularly before we even had vaccines. But we know that that also had negative effects on others, particularly young people. So I worry a lot about the experiences that teenagers and young adults had, that they missed out on so much important connection in their lives at that period of time. So when I look back at, the healthcare system, it really is all intricately connected with our education, with childcare, with work, with families being connected or disconnected, what was happening in our long-term care homes. I think more than anything, we recognize that we're part of a whole, a system that is connected not just within BC, but globally in ways that many of us had never appreciated before. So in terms of how we did, I think we found a balance of trying to do just enough to protect people, to allow, especially young people. One of the things I'm very proud of in this province is that uh, we closed schools for a very short period of time when we didn't know. Who was going to be most affected by this virus? How was it going to be transmitted most effectively? And then we opened schools in June of 2020. and they remained open for the remainder of the pandemic. That was incredibly important, and I really give credit to the group of educators, principals, superintendents, our public health teams. We all had that common goal of making sure that we tried to keep things as normal and as supported as possible for young people. And we did a survey, the Speak survey. You might have, we did 3 iterations of it, but the very first one, we heard from families across the board that children being out of school was hard on everybody. Even, no matter what your income level, how much support you had at home, it was challenging. It was challenging for families, it was challenging for students. And most importantly, children who were falling behind before, they we knew that if they were out of school for too long, they would never make that up, and that would affect them for the rest of their lives. So I'm really proud that we came together, and the parent advisory committees were part of it as well. And as a community, to keep schools open and to try and have that level of support for young people.
You had your critics, though, and some people said they were displeased with your heavy-handed approach to resolving some of our problems with COVID. How did you feel about that?
Well, I tried to have a light touch, but the reality is that as much as, especially early on, I really believe, and I still believe, that if we tell people what we need them to do, we tell them why, we give people the information about why we want them to stay home or reduce the amount of contacts or wear masks. But really importantly, we have to give people the means to do that. So I think about things like telling people to stay home if they're sick. Well, if you're not going to get paid, or you're going to lose your job, or you don't have any way of supporting your family, if you get sick, you don't have the means to stay home. So things like putting in place mandatory sick leave for people, those were things that gave people the means to do what we needed them to do. And I think we had a good, strong sense of that working together as a community for the first part of the pandemic. But when things go on as long as they did, and we're constantly changing, that leads to a level of uncertainty that causes, for many people, it causes fear, it causes anxiety. And some people, that means that they become angry and lash out. And sadly, it also meant that we had to be very clear about why we needed certain things to be done. And that's where some of the orders came into place. But we really tried to minimize those and do only what needed to be done to get us through a very difficult and changing situation. So I like to think we weren't heavy-handed in. Certainly, we weren't compared to many other jurisdictions across the country and internationally, to try and find that balance of doing just enough to protect people as best we can.
People will ask an obvious question at this point. Is it over? Have we said goodbye to COVID-19?
And the simple answer to that is no. The virus is still with us. So SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is still here. But the pandemic is over. The fact that and now we have a level of immunity, and we see this from the data that we've collected. So people have had a good, strong immunity and protection that's long-lasting against severe illness from vaccination. But we also know that many more people have also had a combination of vaccination and infections. So most people in this province, 90% or more, have had some degree of immunity to this virus now, which means it's not causing as severe illness as it used to. It's not killing people in the same way that it did. So we're out of that emergency phase of the pandemic, but we're going to be living with this virus for the foreseeable future. So some of the things that we learned, we need to remember. We need to remember that during the winter, we have other viruses that have now come back. I mean, it was fascinating that we didn't see any influenza for 2 years. And now one of the strains of influenza that we used to see quite regularly, one of the B strains, hasn't been detected in the world in over 2 years. So it's been replaced, though, by this SARS-CoV-2 virus. And we don't yet know the pattern that this virus is going to have over time. It may, as more and more immunity and we have increased updated vaccine shots that give us that extra protection and boost that long-standing memory immunity, it may be that it becomes less and less severe over time. We've seen that with other viruses, other COVID or coronaviruses. We've seen it with some of the adenoviruses, that it becomes less severe. And we may not need to have more updated vaccines for maybe several years. It may be that we'll have a vaccine that will protect us for our lifetime. So those are things that we don't yet know. So we still have to pay attention to this virus, but it's certainly not at the same place it was even a year ago.
One of the things I've heard is that only 1 in 5 people, you talk about updated vaccines, 1 in 5 have not done that. And that's concerning when it comes to seniors. How can you address that challenge?
I know, I think people are tired of it, and certainly we saw that going into the fall. In BC, I can say that both influenza vaccination and the updated COVID vaccines, we have higher rates than anywhere else in the country. And that's a testament to people's understanding and how we've come through this together, and that people want to both protect themselves and those around them who are more susceptible to having severe disease. But as you say, it still remains older people who are more likely, even with the multiple vaccines that we've had, more likely to have severe illness, to end up in hospital, or sadly to die from COVID. So we do really want to encourage older people to get the updated vaccines when they become available, because it helps boost up that antibodies, which protect you from infection in the first place, but it also boosts up your memory immunity that protects you from more severe illness. So it is important.
Lives changed in many ways. Do you think some changes will last throughout our lives? Is this our new normal?
Yeah, it's the next normal, I think. This last 3 years has been a global phenomenon that we've not seen in 100 years at this scale. The last influenza, 1918, 1919 influenza pandemic was the one. And, I look at things like overall mortality worldwide and the increase that we saw in 1918 from the influenza, Spanish flu, it was called. And it mimics what we saw with COVID, that this virus spread around the world so quickly. And I really think, the miracle of getting vaccines within a year is what made all the difference in us being able to manage this. But we've not seen such a global phenomenon with an infectious disease. I think we're much more aware of it now. But I'm also very concerned because along with this global phenomenon, um, everything played out in real time and people could see changes and that people were doing things differently. And we saw this rise of misinformation, which is information that has a grain of truth but is not correct. But really more concerning to me is disinformation. So people intentionally spreading information that is incorrect or wrong to try and appeal to people's emotions, to appeal to people's sense of lack of control when something like this is happening around the world. And that worries me a lot about how we're going to deal with the next crisis that comes up. And we have many things on our horizon that we need to be concerned about and pay attention to. Infectious diseases are only one of them. And, even since this pandemic, we've seen Mpox spread in many communities around the world. We've seen Group A strep, which is a bacterial infection that we've been talking about, increase to levels we've not seen in a long time. But we've also have the challenges that we're dealing with as a society around climate change and wildfires and floods and all of these impacts in our society that really need us to work together and have a common purpose in trying to get through them. And I worry that some of the narrative and the the untruths and the, especially on social media, some of the ongoing discourse is really divisive and polarizing.
As I see it in today's uncertain times, problems seem to be replaced by new problems. For example, there are real concerns in this province and others regarding what some call a toxic drug crisis. Where does that stand at the moment?
Well, this is something that predates the pandemic, where particularly here in British Columbia, we recognized it early, and we're working with communities to try and address. And we I believe we're making some progress. In 2019, rates of deaths were coming down. We were starting to make a difference in terms of keeping people alive. But the pandemic made things much, much worse. So it was not only the fact that many services weren't available for a period of time because things were closed down and there was concerns about spread and needing to be separated from others, but also people lost their jobs, the uncertainty, were home alone when they may have been with other people. And we see that in the data that just came out from the coroner this week, that we had some of the worst years ever on record. And much of that was due to the impacts of inflation and the housing crises and all of these impacts that are happening as the pandemic's fading away and the measures that we put in place have impacts on society. So it's a very, very challenging problem. There's no single solution that's going to happen. What we need to, I believe, be understand that people use drugs for a whole variety of reasons, whether it's physical pain or psychic pain, emotional pain. And for us to, as a society, support people, we need to remove that stigma and shame that keeps people from reaching out for help to their healthcare provider or even talking to their family and friends about their drug use and reaching out for connection. And we know that the connection is what helps people get through challenging times like substance use.
I'm wondering, you've been through a lot, as a lot of people have been. How did this change you? How did it change your life, the way you think about things?
Well, it's I've said this many times, but I am very much an introvert. So I often say, this pandemic would have been lovely if I wasn't in the position I was in, because I could have stayed home by myself and read books. Um, but it has made me recognize how important it is that um, how we connect with people is so important, and language matters. How we deal with people and the challenges they're going through matters. I learned a tremendous amount personally about the challenges of colonization and the impacts on First Nations communities and First Nations Métis and Inuit people in this province through this crisis. And the role that I need to play as a settler in this country to undo the structures that we have in place that are white supremacist structures that are put in place that give unearned advantage and privilege to people like me who are white people in this system, and that we need to address and call out anti-Indigenous racism and racism in all its forms. This is something that I think I was conscious of prior to the pandemic, but being in the position I was in, working with leaders from across this province and across the country around the issues we were dealing with, really hit home to me that these are important health indicators, things that we can do that will improve the health of populations across our province. And so that's one of the things that has changed me immensely, that I am committed to. We have a work that we're doing within our office, and sometimes it feels overwhelming that there's all of these things in place, and we call them colonial knots. But we can do our work as people who are part of this system and leaders in this system to remove these barriers that lead to poorer health outcomes for people who are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, to people who are gender diverse, and recognizing that we are all human, and we all have the same are in the same place in this world, and we need to uphold that for everybody.
Well, to end our conversation with a touch of levity and for the musical enjoyment of our audience, I thought I'd have our producer play The Ballad of Bonnie Henry, which was penned by BC Order of Canada musician, lawyer, Phil Dwyer. I thought it would be a fitting tribute. But before we cut to the music, if I could coin a phrase you've become known for during the pandemic, I would say to our audience, be kind, be calm, be safe. Dr. Henry, I've thoroughly enjoyed spending some time with you once again. I want to say that you were a beacon of light during the pandemic, and I continue to value your insights. It's also been so lovely to get to know the woman behind the credentials. Thank you so much for being with us virtually in the studio today.
Well, thanks. I was telling people that I was talking to, and they're going, "Oh, wow, we haven't seen him in years. How's he doing?" So,
look, he's so old, my God.
Greetings from my housekeeper who was there this morning.
Is that
He was
right?
saying,
That's
look at Tony Parsons.
That's very flattering. Thanks so much. Perhaps we'll talk again.
All right, take care.
Okay, you too.
Thank
Bye.
you.
I figured we're
neighbors a good 6 feet away. She's had lots of help in her search for a fix, not the least of whom is Mr.